Welcome back. Tonight's story will stay with you long after it ends. She was promised to a duke from birth. But on their wedding day, in front of everyone, he chose her younger sister instead. This is the story of a woman who lost everything.
The morning Eliza Crane learned she was disposable, the sun came through the chapel windows in shafts of gold that made everything look holy. She stood at the altar in her mother's wedding gown, the lace collar scratching against her throat like a promise about to break. Across from her, Duke Nathaniel Harrow looked past her shoulder as though she were a portrait he'd grown tired of viewing. She had practiced her vows every night for 3 months. She knew the exact rhythm of his name in her mouth, but when the officiant asked if anyone objected to this union, the chapel doors exploded open with a sound that would live in her nightmares forever. Her younger sister Margot stood in the doorway, her copper hair wild around her shoulders, her dress torn at the hem from running. She was crying, not the delicate tears of a moved witness, but the ugly, gasping sobs of someone confessing a sin. "I'm carrying his child," Margot said, her voice breaking the sacred silence like a stone through glass. Eliza felt her lungs forget how to work. She turned to Nathaniel, waiting for him to deny it, to laugh, to do anything that would make sense of this moment. Instead, he closed his eyes, just closed them, as though he could wish away the scandal by refusing to see it. The chapel erupted into whispers that sounded like wasps. Eliza's mother made a sound, somewhere between a gasp and a moan. Her father stood up so quickly, his chair fell backward and crashed against the stone floor. But Eliza couldn't move. She stood there in her scratchy lace collar, holding a bouquet of winter roses that cost more than most families earned in a year, and felt her entire existence rearrange itself into something unrecognizable. Nathaniel opened his eyes and looked at Margot with an expression Eliza had never seen him wear. Softness, actual tenderness, the kind of look she'd imagined receiving on their wedding night when they were finally alone and could stop performing their roles. "I'm sorry," he said, but he was looking at Margot when he said it. "I never meant for this to happen." Eliza heard herself laugh. It came out wrong, too high and sharp, the sound of something breaking. "You never meant for what to happen? For me to find out?" Her father reached the altar, his face purple with rage. "You will marry my daughter. The contracts are signed. The agreements are sealed. You have no choice in this matter." Nathaniel finally looked at Eliza then, really looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes was worse than hatred. It was pity. "I won't marry someone I don't love when the woman I do love is carrying my child," he said quietly, "even if it costs me everything." The word everything hung in the air like smoke, as though Eliza was nothing, as though 23 years of preparation, of etiquette lessons and language tutoring, and learning to pour tea at the exact right temperature had been for absolutely nothing. Her mother was suddenly beside her, gripping her arm hard enough to bruise. "Say something," she hissed. "Don't just stand there like a fool. Fight for your position." But Eliza couldn't fight. She couldn't even breathe properly, because the truth was settling into her bones like winter cold. And the truth was this. She had been promised to Nathaniel Harrow since she was 6 years old. She had shaped her entire life around becoming his duchess. She had turned down every other suitor, ignored every other possibility, learned his favorite foods and his political positions, and the exact way he liked his study arranged. And none of it had mattered, because he had fallen in love with Margot in the 3 months since Margot had returned from finishing school in Vienna. 3 months. That's all it took to undo 17 years of planning. Margot was still crying in the doorway. "Eliza, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. But I love him. I've loved him since the summer party. And I tried to stay away. I really did, but... Get out!" Eliza's voice didn't sound like her own. It sounded like someone else entirely. Someone harder and colder and capable of surviving this. Both of you could get out of my sight. Nathaniel took a step toward her, but her father blocked his path. You've made your choice, Your Grace. Now live with the consequences. My family will pursue every legal remedy available to us. The betrothal contract specifically includes penalties for breach. I'll pay them, Nathaniel said simply. Every pound. I'll liquidate estates if I have to. But I won't marry without love. Eliza wanted to scream that love was a luxury, that people like them didn't marry for love, that he had known this since childhood just like she had. But her throat had closed up entirely. She couldn't make a sound. The officiant, an elderly bishop who had known her since baptism, touched her shoulder gently. My child, perhaps you'd like to retire to the vestry, away from the crowd? She nodded because it was the only movement she could manage. Her mother and father started arguing with Nathaniel's family, in voices that grew louder and uglier by the second. Margot had collapsed against the doorframe, still sobbing. The wedding guests were standing now, their phones out, already spreading this story to every corner of society. Eliza let the bishop guide her through a side door into a small room that smelled of old incense and furniture polish. She sat down in a wooden chair and stared at her hands. They were shaking. Everything was shaking. Through the thick walls, she could hear her father's voice rising in fury. She could hear her mother's sharper tones, accusatory and vicious. She could hear Margot's continued crying. But she couldn't hear Nathaniel anymore. He had probably already left with her sister, already planning their future together, while Eliza sat alone in a borrowed room, wearing a dress that now meant nothing. The bishop didn't offer platitudes. He just sat across from her in silence, his weathered hands folded in his lap, waiting for her to speak first. I don't know who I am, Eliza finally whispered. If I'm not his future wife, if I'm not going to be a duchess, then who am I? The question hung in the small space between them. And the bishop, wise enough to know that some questions don't have immediate answers, simply nodded. Outside, the argument was reaching a fever pitch. She heard something shatter, maybe a vase or a window. She heard her father shout something about honor and contracts and consequences. She heard her mother demand that Margot be disowned immediately, cut off from the family entirely. But Eliza just sat there in her uncomfortable chair, in her scratchy lace collar, holding her expensive winter roses, and felt something inside her chest cave in like a building whose foundation had just been removed, because the truth was finally fully settling in. She had never been a person to them, not to her parents, who had promised her away before she could walk, not to Nathaniel, who had accepted the arrangement without protest, but never once tried to know her. She had been an asset, a contract, a political arrangement wrapped in white lace. And now that the contract was broken, she had to figure out what she actually was underneath all those years of careful preparation, if there was anything underneath at all. The bishop stood slowly, his knees cracking. I'll leave you alone, child. Take all the time you need. When he left, Eliza finally let herself cry. Not the delicate tears expected of disappointed brides, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for the girl she'd been, who had believed in promises. She cried for the future that had just evaporated. But mostly, she cried because she realized she wasn't even crying over Nathaniel himself. She was crying over the loss of her purpose. 3 weeks after the wedding that never happened, Eliza discovered that humiliation had a specific weight to it. It pressed down on her shoulders every time she left the house, every time a former friend crossed the street to avoid her, every time a newspaper printed another speculative article about the Crane family's fall from grace. Her father had locked himself in his study for the first 5 days, so emerging only to shout at lawyers who couldn't break an ironclad betrothal contract that Nathaniel was willing to pay any price to escape. Her mother had taken to her bed with what the doctor diplomatically called nervous exhaustion, but what everyone really knew was shame so profound it had made her physically ill. And Margot? Margot had vanished the night of the failed wedding. Nathaniel had taken her somewhere private, away from the scandal, probably to some country estate, where they could pretend the world didn't exist. Eliza spent those 3 weeks in a strange fog, going through motions that felt increasingly pointless. She ate because the housekeeper insisted. She bathed because routine demanded it. She sat in the morning room and stared at walls she'd looked at her entire life, and felt like a ghost haunting her own existence. But on the 22nd day, something changed. A letter arrived, not through normal post, but delivered by a private courier who refused to identify his employer. The envelope was thick cream paper, expensive, but unmarked. No return address. No seal. Eliza opened it in her bedroom with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in elegant script. Your sister is not pregnant. Meet me at the Ashford Gardens fountain at midnight if you want to know what really happened. Come alone. Tell no one. Burn this letter. She read it 7 times. Each word seemed to rearrange reality slightly, like looking at her life through a shifting kaleidoscope. Not pregnant. The 2 words that had justified everything, that had given Nathaniel permission to destroy her future in the name of honor and responsibility. Not pregnant. Her first instinct was to show her parents. Her second was to assume it was a cruel prank. But her third instinct, the one that settled deepest and refused to be ignored, was darker. It whispered that she had never actually seen proof. Only Margot's tear-stained confession and Nathaniel's immediate acceptance. What if there was no baby? What if there had never been a baby? The question opened up possibilities that made her feel sick and electric at the same time. Because if Margot had lied, then everything that followed was deliberate, calculated. The crying, the dramatic entrance, the destruction of Eliza's wedding, all of it would have been theater designed to steal what was never hers to take. Eliza looked at the clock. On 9:15 in the evening, she had less than 3 hours to decide if she was brave enough or foolish enough to walk into what might be a trap. She burned the letter in her fireplace and watched the cream paper curl and blacken. Then she waited until the house fell silent, until her parents had retired to their separate bedrooms and the servants had finished their evening duties. At 11:30, she dressed in the darkest clothes she owned, practical boots instead of delicate shoes, and a cloak with a deep hood. The Crane estate bordered Ashford Gardens, a sprawling public park that had been donated to the city by some long-dead philanthropist. During the day, it was full of families and couples. At night, it belonged to shadows and secrets. Eliza had never been anywhere alone at midnight in her life. She'd never been anywhere alone at all, really. There had always been chaperones, companions, maids trailing 3 steps behind. But tonight, she climbed out her bedroom window onto the oak tree she'd been forbidden to touch since childhood, and she dropped into the garden with her heart hammering against her ribs. The walk to the fountain took 12 minutes. Every sound made her jump. Every shadow looked like it might contain someone waiting to hurt her. She thought about turning back 7 times, but the words, "not pregnant," kept pulling her forward like a rope tied around her chest. The fountain stood in the center of a circular plaza, its water shut off for winter. In the moonlight, it looked like a monument to something forgotten, and standing beside it, so still she almost missed her in the darkness, was a woman in a gray traveling cloak. "You came." The woman's voice was cultured, educated, but Eliza didn't recognize it. "I wasn't certain you would." "Who are you?" Eliza stayed several feet back, every muscle tensed for flight. The woman pushed back her hood, and Eliza felt the world tilt sideways again. She was looking at a face she'd seen exactly once, at a dinner party 2 years ago. Lady Catherine Voss, Nathaniel's former fiancée. The engagement had been brief and broken quietly before Nathaniel was redirected to Eliza through their family's arrangement. "You," Eliza breathed. "Why would you?" "Because he did to you what he did to me," Catherine said, and her voice carried a bitterness that sounded like old wine turned to vinegar. "And I'm tired of watching him destroy people without consequences." "What do you mean? I'm not pregnant? How would you possibly know?" Catherine reached into her cloak and pulled out a folded document. "Because 3 days ago, your sister visited a private physician in the medical district. Not her usual doctor. Someone discreet, expensive, the kind you see when you need something kept quiet. I have friends who work in such places. Friends who owe me favors." She held out the document. Eliza took it with numb fingers and tilted it toward the moonlight. It was a medical report, signed and dated. The relevant line was underscored. "Patient shows no evidence of pregnancy. Examination confirms patient is not, nor has recently been with child." This could be forged, Eliza whispered, but even as she said it, she could feel the truth of it settling into her bones, like the truth about her disposability had 3 weeks ago. "It could be," Catherine agreed, "but it's not. Your sister lied, Miss Crane. She lied about carrying Nathaniel's child to justify taking him from you. And he either knew and didn't care, or was fool enough to believe her without verification. Either way, they both deserve what's coming." Eliza looked up from the document, her mind racing through implications faster than she could process them. "Why are you telling me this? What do you gain?" Catherine's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "Revenge is what I gain. Nathaniel Harrow humiliated me 2 years ago. Broke our engagement 3 weeks before the wedding. Claimed he didn't love me. That he couldn't go through with a loveless marriage. Then turned around and accepted an arrangement with you without protest. Do you know what that did to my reputation? My prospects? So this is about your wounded pride." "No," Catherine said, and her voice went cold. "This is about justice. He can't keep doing this. Breaking promises, destroying futures, walking away without consequences because he's a duke, and society forgives powerful men everything. But if you expose your sister's lie, if you reveal that there never was a pregnancy, the scandal becomes something else entirely. It becomes fraud, manipulation, a deliberate scheme to break a legal contract." Eliza's hands were shaking again. "They'd be ruined. Both of them." "Yes." Catherine's eyes glittered in the moonlight. "Completely. Nathaniel would lose his reputation, possibly his title if the legal implications are severe enough. Your sister would be branded a liar and a schemer. No one in society would touch either of them. They'd have each other, certainly, but they'd have nothing else." The medical report felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in Eliza's hands. She thought about Margot's tears, how genuine they'd seemed. She thought about Nathaniel's tender expression, his willingness to sacrifice everything for love and honor. All of it theater, all of it lies built on a lie. "What do I do with this?" Eliza asked quietly. Catherine stepped closer. "You make a choice. You can destroy them both. Reclaim some measure of your dignity. Show the world that you're not just a victim of their schemes. Or you can walk away. Let them have their happiness built on lies, and spend the rest of your life wondering who you might have been if you'd chosen yourself over propriety." The fountain loomed behind Catherine like a silent witness. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled midnight, and Eliza Crane, who had spent 23 years being told exactly who she was and what her purpose would be, realized she was standing at a crossroads that no one had prepared her for. Because the girl who had stood at that altar 3 weeks ago would have walked away, would have chosen dignity over revenge, propriety over justice, would have let herself fade into obscurity rather than create more scandal. But that girl had died in the chapel, and whoever was standing here now, holding proof of betrayal in her shaking hands, wasn't her anymore. Eliza stood in the moonlit plaza, the medical report clutching between her fingers, and felt 2 futures split before her like a forked path in a dark forest. Catherine Voss watched her with hungry eyes, waiting for rage to tip the scales toward revenge. But something unexpected was happening inside Eliza's chest. Instead of fury, she felt a strange clarity settling over her like the first light of dawn. She looked down at the document that could destroy her sister and Nathaniel and realized with sudden certainty that she didn't want to destroy anyone. She wanted to be free. "No," Eliza said quietly, and handed the document back to Catherine. Catherine's face twisted with confusion and anger. "What do you mean, no? They lied to you. They humiliated you in front of everyone who matters. This is your chance to make them pay." "I know what they did." Eliza's voice was steadier than it had been in weeks. "But using this would make me exactly what everyone already thinks I am. A scorned woman obsessed with a man who never loved her. And the truth is, Lady Voss, I don't want revenge. I want something you can't give me. And what's that? A life that's actually mine." Catherine stared at her like she'd started speaking a foreign language. "You're a fool. You'll be nothing without the Harrow name. Your family's finances depend on that union. Your social standing is already ruined. Without revenge, you have nothing." "No," Eliza said, and felt something powerful unfurl inside her chest. "Without revenge, I have everything. I have choice. I have freedom. I have the rest of my life to figure out who I actually am when I'm not performing a role someone else wrote for me." She turned to leave, but Catherine grabbed her arm. "If you walk away now, there's no coming back from this. I won't offer you this opportunity again." Eliza gently removed Catherine's hand from her sleeve. "Good, because I never want to see that document again. I never want to become someone who builds her future on someone else's destruction, even if they deserve it." She left Catherine standing by the fountain, walked back through the dark gardens, and climbed back through her bedroom window as dawn was breaking over the city. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat at her writing desk and began making lists. Things she knew how to do. Things she'd learned in 23 years of preparation for a role she'd never play. Languages: French, German, Italian. Skills: estate management, event planning, financial accounting, negotiation, education, literature, history, political theory, mathematics. By the time the sun was fully up, she had filled 3 pages. And looking at them, she realized her mother had been wrong about one crucial thing. Well, Eliza wasn't ruined. She was educated, capable, and no longer bound by a contract that had defined her since childhood. She was, for the first time in her life, unmarketable, which meant she was finally free to find her own market. The plan came together over the next 2 weeks. Eliza had a small trust fund her grandmother had left her, money her father couldn't touch because it was in her name alone. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to rent a modest apartment in the city and sustain herself for several months while she figured out her next move. She told her parents on a Tuesday morning over breakfast her mother had finally come down to share. Her father's face turned purple. Her mother actually fainted, though Eliza suspected it was more theatrical than genuine. "You cannot live alone," her father thundered. "It's unseemly. Impossible. What will people say?" "They're already saying I'm a jilted fool," Eliza replied calmly. "I might as well be a jilted fool who's doing something interesting with her life." "And what exactly do you plan to do?" her mother asked weakly from the sofa, where she'd been revived with smelling salts. "I'm going to start a consulting service. There are dozens of newly wealthy families in this city who have money, but no idea how to navigate society. They need someone to teach them etiquette, protocol, how to host proper events, and manage estates. I've spent my entire life learning these things. It's time I got paid for the expertise. Her father laughed, but it sounded forced. No one will hire you. You're scandalous. No, Eliza corrected. I'm notorious. There's a difference, and nouveau riche families don't care about scandal. They care about results. I can teach their daughters what I know. I can help their families avoid the social mistakes that mark them as outsiders. I can offer something valuable. She moved out 3 days later, with only what she could carry. Her parents didn't help. They barely spoke to her. But as she closed the door on the only house she'd ever known, Eliza felt lighter than she had in months. The apartment was small, just 2 rooms above a bookshop in a respectable but unfashionable neighborhood. It smelled like old paper and coffee from the cafe next door. It was perfect. Within a month, she had her first client, a shipping merchant's wife who wanted her daughter to be accepted by society, despite their lack of pedigree. Eliza charged what she knew she was worth and delivered results. Within 3 months, that daughter had received invitations to parties that would have been closed to her otherwise. Word spread, quietly at first, then faster. Eliza Crane, the jilted bride who'd turned humiliation into a business, the woman who knew all of society's secrets because she'd been raised inside them. She was scandalous, yes, but she was also useful. And in a city where new money was flooding in faster than old money could keep up, useful was more valuable than respectable. 6 months after the wedding that never happened, Eliza was sitting in her small apartment, reviewing her accounts, when someone knocked on her door. She opened it to find Margot standing in the hallway, looking thin and pale, and nothing like the radiant girl who'd burst through chapel doors. "May I come in?" Margot's voice was small. Eliza considered closing the door. Instead, she stepped aside and let her sister enter. They sat across from each other at Eliza's tiny kitchen table. Margot twisted her hands in her lap, unable to meet Eliza's eyes. "There was no baby," Margot finally whispered. "There was never a baby. I lied because I loved him, and I thought if I gave him a reason to choose me, he would. And then it was too late to take it back." "I know," Eliza said quietly. Margot's head snapped up. "You know? How long have you known?" "Long enough." Eliza poured them both tea from a simple pot that had cost a fraction of what the family china had. "Why are you telling me now?" Tears spilled down Margot's cheeks. "Because he left me. A month after we were married in a quiet ceremony, he realized I'd lied. Someone had mentioned pregnancy timelines, and the dates didn't match up, and he confronted me, and I broke down and confessed. He was so angry, Eliza. Not loud angry, but cold, like I'd killed something inside him. He said I'd made him into the kind of man he'd never wanted to be. Someone who breaks promises and destroys people. He said I'd stolen his chance to be honorable. And?" Eliza's voice was careful, neutral. "And he left. Filed for annulment on grounds of fraud. I'm back with mother and father, and they won't even look at me. I destroyed everything. Your life, my life, our family's name. All because I thought I loved him." Margot's whole body was shaking now. "I came to say I'm sorry. I know it doesn't fix anything. I know you probably hate me. But I needed you to know that I'm sorry." Eliza looked at her sister, this girl who'd been so desperate for love that she'd destroyed everything to get it. And she felt something surprising. Not forgiveness exactly, but not hatred either. More like recognition. They'd both been trapped in the same system, just in different ways. Both taught that their value came from who they married, rather than who they were. "I don't hate you," Eliza said finally. "I'm angry and hurt. and it'll take a long time before I can think about you without feeling both. But I don't hate you, because in a strange way, you freed me." Margot looked up, confused. "What?" "You destroyed the life I thought I was supposed to have, and it forced me to build something real instead. I'm happy, Margot. For the first time in my life, I'm actually happy. I have work I care about, independence I earned myself, a future I'm creating rather than waiting to inherit. None of that would have happened if you hadn't lied. So you forgive me?" "Maybe someday," Eliza said honestly. "But not today. Today I'm just telling you that I survived, and eventually you will too. You'll have to figure out who you are when you're not trying to be someone's love story. It's harder than it sounds, but it's worth it." Margot left shortly after, and Eliza returned to her accounts. As she worked, she caught sight of her reflection in the window. The face looking back at her was thinner than it had been, with shadows under the eyes from late nights building something from nothing. But it was also stronger, more certain. 3 years later, Eliza's consulting service had expanded to include a small school where she taught etiquette, estate management, and business skills to young women from all social classes. She'd written a book on social navigation that had become quietly influential. She'd been invited to speak at universities. She'd also, unexpectedly, fallen in love. Not with a duke or anyone from her old world, but with the bookshop owner, whose apartment she'd rented above. A kind, funny man who'd never heard of her scandal and wouldn't have cared if he had. Someone who loved her for her mind and her ambition and the way she laughed when she was truly happy. On a spring morning, standing in her school's sunny classroom, teaching a group of eager young women how to negotiate their worth, Eliza realized something profound. The girl who'd stood at that altar in her scratchy lace collar had been half-formed, waiting for someone else to complete her story. But the woman she'd become had written her own ending, and it was better than any fairy tale she'd been promised.